Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another podcast of the Authentic Sound Podcast. Stefan is waving at you as always, and I'm telling that because of the audio listeners or listeners to the podcast. We have also a video version of the podcast, and because this podcast is going to be released the 29th of December, we're going to release it also in full on YouTube the 31st of December. So for those who've always listened to the podcast, you have a unique opportunity this time, I would say, to see us for the entire podcast this time. So, and this podcast will be very special and maybe also a little bit unexpected. We are going to talk about historical durations, durations in the sense of like concert lengths. We talked about 2 weeks ago already about the 1808 Beethoven concert. That's a very important set of data actually that we have from this huge data collection of the 19th century's concert or whatever collection of data that represents concerts or pieces or performances of musical pieces. And this time we're going to touch something else. We're going to open a little bit the document again that was created like 4 or 5 years ago by a certain gentleman named Fafner in 1988. We still don't have his real name. And why is this document so important? Why is it so important to talk about? We're going to touch upon that, of course, soon. But just very briefly, this document had quite some impact in, well, let's say, historically informed performance practice. There are numerous mentions of this document showing up also in conservatories as a kind of counter-argument, so to say, against whole beat. And since this document is actually keeps coming back to the surface, we thought no better way to tackle this because this document with the help of our friend Stefan, who has a master in mathematics. So it's very important and very interesting to also talk to people who are not musicologists, but actually know how to read the data and to see if the data actually hold up against the claims that this document makes. So that's the reason why we are going to talk about that. This will be a podcast where we dive into numbers, when we dive into terms like bell curves. We had a little bit back and forth before and at the preparation of this podcast, and I learned a lot. And so I'm sure you, if you're not a mathematician or a other expert other than musician, then you will learn a lot as well, and it will be very interesting. Essential, maybe not, because the data on durations are not essential to understand metronome marks. For that, metronome marks are not in the need of anything else but themselves. They're frequency per minute, and we can use them in two ways. That's in a single beat method, where you take every click or where you connect every click to the note value in the metronome mark. That's actually the way we are using the metronome generally today, or what we call whole beat, where you actually take two ticks, so the back and forth, the 1 and 2 together to represent that note value in the metronome mark, like many physicists still do today. So you only have those two options, and so metronome marks do not need any other explanation. But it's interesting to talk about the durations in general, but especially because it's used so heavily to debunk whole beat. We will see in this podcast if that claim holds, well, is strong enough to that we can maintain that. That, I think, was the kind of introduction all over the place, Stefan, but we have so many things to talk about that I was a little bit all over the place myself. So let's dive into the content and let's move forward with this Fafner document about historical durations, shall we?
Let's do exactly that, and welcome also from my side, guys. That was Wim's just about 4 minutes introduction.
Really?
Yes.
I talk too much.
I'm looking at my timer here on the right, and I'm also sitting in my old apartment in my kitchen because nothing else still contains furniture in my old apartment. So just as a side note, if you guys want to see part of my old kitchen, then you have to check out the video podcast. Just kidding, but way more important is me waving at the camera at the beginning of every podcast. So if you want to have that, then you better check out the video podcast over on Substack, or we have parts of it on YouTube and also on Patreon, of course. But this document is very interesting, and I just looked at it closely. And when I stumbled across probabilities, I was like, oh, this is getting interesting now.
You like that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I studied mathematics in university, and I saw data points. I saw probabilities, and I was like, what are you doing here? And then my head was like, something feels off. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But you made the correct introduction already. I mean, people listened probably to our podcast on the 1808 concert, so they know our opinions on data, or not data, sorry, but on concert durations or durations in general. And if I can summarize it in one sentence, it's garbage in, garbage out. Basically, durations of concerts are a lot less accurate or clearly defined descriptor of musical playing speed compared to metronome marks. As you said, metronome marks are a frequency per minute. There is no discussion about that. When it comes to durations, there are so many elements that that influence the duration of a performance that it just becomes a lot less imprecise data in general. And people know our opinion on that, so that doesn't change also with this document. But as this document, as we will see in a few minutes, it makes some very, very strong claims. And we will see basically in this podcast from two perspectives. We'll analyze it from a musicological perspective and from a mathematical perspective, because again, probabilities. And the mathematical perspective, that will be my expertise, and the musicological perspective will be more your expertise. But yeah, I also know a little bit about research, as again, I studied at university, and it will be interesting to have a discussion about that. But I think as a good starting point to this podcast, what we should do is we should take a look at the document itself, because the document itself makes claims and also is quite long. I think it's about 70 or 80 pages. So
80
it's not
pages, yeah.
It's not a short document. And as you said, there is a real story behind it, that it was shared at universities and used as an argument. And even our friend Alberto was talked or was like a victim of this document, you could say, because it was said, yeah, you have this document and that proves everything. Of course, he can defend himself. He knows his stuff. But yeah, the fact that this document is used in universities, and if we take a close look at it, we will come to quite shocking conclusions to maybe foreshadow a little bit what we will talk about in a few minutes. It's interesting to see that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, the reason what I said in the introduction is true. We're talking about it again. I made a video on YouTube. I watched that. I mean, it was 2022 or 23. I mean, time flies, But basically, I hit the points from my side there, debunking, so to say, the claims that the document makes. We're gonna dive much deeper into this and analyze the data that are behind this. But it's true that still on this day I receive emails, but also you can go on my YouTube channel. It will be hard for you because I have over 1,000 videos. I can see the comments lined up in the back end of YouTube. Numerous people still come to the videos on Wholebeat and say it has been debunked because we have this document on duration. It's unbelievable what an impact this document had, and unbelievable in the sense that the way it was created has so many flaws that it should be clear to anyone, even if you have not a master in mathematics, that there is something wrong with this, starting with already what are you investigating? Why do you make this huge bulk of data? What is your point? And what the claim I made in my video, and you can check it out. The claim is they want to debunk my claim of Wholebeat. Well, that's fine. But why do I claim, so to say, quote unquote claim that Wholebeat existed in the 19th century? What is the initial problem? They don't talk about it, so that's part of the problem. But the impact of this document was huge. I mean, you talked about Alberto Sana, my partner at the piano, so to say, is recording now the complete Beethoven keyboard works. Third box as we speak in recording. The second box will be released in early 26, so in a few weeks, if you watched or listened to this podcast at the time of its release. But when he was studying in Brussels, I mean, it's long enough that I can say where, he was there doing his master's in piano, and so he was already 1 year when people behind his back, his teachers, so to say, and especially the ones of the early music department, knew that he was like working with me. And it was kind of hilarious, the stories that came out there. Some people didn't know that he played the pianoforte for years already. And they, when they did like an introduction exam for the historical performed part of the conservatory, people said like, yeah, you can tell that you've never played the fortepiano and things like that. He never did that. He studied just his master's at the regular piano. But after a year, they came to the surface like, yeah, we're having this guy here in our conservatory, really. And then his teacher, not say his name, we can easily think about who it was. He had a discussion with him 5 minutes, and Alberto said, I'm happy to have a discussion with you. And why do you not invite Wim for a coffee? That never happened, by the way. He just pulled out a print of this document. He said, I have nothing to say. This proves you wrong. And it's like seeing all these people that have an interest or are a little bit afraid of this change, or like, and which I can imagine. They have like studied their entire life to basically meet the tempos given by Chopin, his etudes, and they do not match those tempos. I mean, it's for many people impossible, if not flat out for everyone. And then comes like a crazy guy like me making all these claims, and they have nothing really to debunk that. And then comes this document, and they stand like shoulder to shoulder, like, and we're not going to dive into the details of the document, but just the claims that it makes feels good to us. So we are going to take it at face value without actually diving into it and like seeing if it really can hold the claims that it's making. And so that's a little bit a frustrating thing that we are fighting, quote unquote, not real fighting, but like intellectually fighting a battle that this document can not win because logic will prevail anyways, but has still an impact and not giving the possibilities to really say, but this document proves just the opposite of what it claims to prove. And so that's the reason, that's part of the reason that we dive into this document again today, and hopefully for the final time. And hopefully this message is reaching a lot of people, because if we want to reconstruct our musical past, in a sense, like create the Fifth Symphony the way that Beethoven had it in his mind, and we will never, ever get there, because how can we reconstruct accentuation, the nuances, things like that? The technical level that these people had was so much lower than what we have today. I mean, there's not something you have to invent. I mean, that's like logic itself. Just go and watch like footage of the Olympic Games in the 1930s. I mean, that's a joke when you see it. But we have also sources of people that live in the 1920s, 1930s saying that. But yeah, if we want to reconstruct that, at least the only thing we have, the only door that just of the window that gives like a glimpse of how it was in that time are the metronome marks. It's a tempo, because changing tempo changes everything. Changing tempo so drastically changes, of course, a lot. And so I'm just flabbergasted sometimes, so for the reason that why people have so much trouble just facing the facts, because that's the thing, Stefan. And then I give the word to you to guide us through all of your preparation. These metronome marks are flat out impossible as a whole. There are here and there, of course, the top virtuosos can play some Chopin etudes and single beat, but generally speaking, it's like a joke when you still want to make the claim that single beat had, like, you don't need documents, you don't need historical research, you don't need facts. You just look at a certain solid collection of metronome marks, and then you see like, but I cannot play like 80%, and I cannot actually pay people. If I had like an unlimited budget, I wouldn't find the musicians who could live perform that on stage with the metronome ticking. It's not possible. And so it's for me like so difficult to understand why it is so hard for people to just like intellectually be honest about this and just face it. Probably there are sociological reasons for that. We're not going to dive into that. We're going to dive into mathematics and data. So that's the backstory. And now I'm going to give the word, I promise, to you, and I will just interrupt you when I don't understand something, or maybe have like a stupid addition to what you are going to say.
Stupid additions is that's your best way of adding value to this podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
No, let's just before we dive into the let's call it analysis. Let's maybe take a look at the document and the claims that the document makes. I mean, we're not going to go through all 80 pages, but it's interesting to have a look at the document itself. So the document, as we already discussed, is titled Historical Evidence of Tempi in the 18th and 19th Century. Okay, that's an interesting start. And what it claims in the very first sentence is that the purpose of this document is to bring together a comprehensive body of historical sources describing the musical tempi that have been practiced in the 18th and 19th century in Europe. Okay, this document lists over 200 different sources of various kinds, blah, 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 that provide measurements of concert timings and calculated estimates of various musical pieces in minutes and hours. Okay. That sounds very interesting. If we move down to the contents, you see that, well, it's first of all, there's a lot of composers here that you can see, and there's of course mentionings of timings in connection with these composers or people or opera bills or something like that. But the interesting part is, of course, the section interpretation and analysis. So people can probably find that document on Google if they really want to check it out. And that's where it gets really interesting. So the first sentence of the chapter Interpretation and Analysis says, "My motivation for compiling this document was to present clear and unambiguous evidence in order to assess the historical plausibility of the so-called double beat or whole beat theory about historical metronome indications as it is advocated by Wim Winters on his YouTube channel Authentic Sound." Well, apparently you're very famous because you're namely mentioned in this very important paper, Mr. Winters. So what do you think of that?
I'm a research object. I love that. Really. Do more research on whole beat. I can only encourage that.
Yeah. So this is kind of a big claim. So what you read here is basically that this document claims from the historical durations it wants to assess the historical plausibility of whole beat, basically proving that whole beat was never a thing, which is interesting because that means the only other alternative would be what, Mr. Winters?
Well, that would be single beat, of course.
Yeah, and how can you play Czerny's Opus 299 in single beat?
That's the point. That's the point where people are freaking out when I keep saying that. And then they say, yeah, it's already done. No, it's never done. And I mean, even if you find somebody who could play 15 notes per second, they'll give you something else that is more difficult than that, because Opus 299 was, especially number 1 to 20, was meant for beginners. So there must have been something in the waters in Vienna in that time.
Definitely, yeah. And so just to give this part, and if we move then down, it does actually a case study on the 3rd and 9th symphony, because apparently these are symphonies that have concrete durations that can be found. And the interesting part is that the conclusion that the author, Mr. Fafner, who remained anonymous, makes afterwards, and I will read that through completely and then we'll talk about it, because this is very interesting.
By the way, before you do that, Mr. Fafner, it's interesting that he doesn't give his name or her name. The video that I made about the document, he replied actually, and I invited him on a podcast. We didn't have this podcast back then, but that would have been a live streamed podcast with Alberto and myself. But now, I mean, the invitation still stands. Huh? I mean, just come over with all people that are, so to say, at the other side of the spectrum. Like you could say, like Martin Noorter, and he's one of the most advocates, so to say, of single beat with his master thesis on Beethoven's tempo indication. No, his doctoral thesis, I should say. Clive Brown, Barry Cooper. I mean, we just want to talk with you about this stuff. And so invitation still stands. So if you want to reach out, we have a website, there's an email. contact. So you just send an email, and sometimes I forget to check, and but Stefan will remind me that I have many mails that are behind. So then I will clean my mailbox of authentic sound again, and I will find your questions. So we would be happy to have all of you on our podcast. And that's a sincere remark. Nothing in this podcast is like cynical or skeptical or sarcastic. We really want to talk to people because we believe that everybody is looking for the historical truth. And so by talking about this with each other, and especially when you reach across the aisle, so to say, to the other side, then you do not stay in your own group, which of course has a certain bias towards one of the other solution, but you reach out to somebody with another opinion. And from there, you can come closer to the truth. I'm very sure about that. But continue, Stefan.
Yeah, but that's true. The invitation stands all day, every time. So what the document now reads here, and I continue to quote. First, I do not wish to claim that this data shows that Beethoven's symphonies, or the music by any other composer for that matter, were always played strictly according to Beethoven's metronome indications in single beat during the early 19th century. The data clearly shows that they were not. This, however, should hardly come as a surprise. No reasonable defender of single beat needs to claim that the metronome marks left by the composers must have been followed by all people at all times. Nor do we need to invent some ad hoc theory of 1/3 beat or whatever in order to force the existing metronome indications into a perfect match with the known historical tempi. End quote. So this was not me interpreting anything. This is just me reading the document.
But it's there's a very important passage, and I remember in the video I made, this was for me the core essential part of the entire document, because here this should have been the conclusion at the beginning. Like, okay, if you are investigating me and my claim, well, so to say, neutrally to see if the data back the claim up, but of course the document was not made to just see whatever solution would work or not. Here we come to the actually only interpretation, like the data clearly show that musicians did not follow the metronome marks. And that is to say, we're going to talk about that all data that are presented are worth actually taking at face value, because there are so many problems with the data. Like you say, your term you use for mathematicians, like GIGO, is it like a garbage in, garbage out? That applies to this, of course, very, very, very much. But the conclusion that you come to the conclusion on your even like unassessed data, so to say, that in general, you come to the conclusion, yeah, but these data prove clearly that musicians in the 19th century did not follow metronome marks. We don't need durations data to know that. There are plenty of sources, and the book will have like a large section, there's a chapter on that, where actually the chapter calls like the problem deepens. 19th century musicians in general either did not have any interest in historical performance practice. We claim today, or we think today, that if we would be able to hear somebody play Beethoven sonata, let's say Hans van Bülow in 1892, I'm not whatever, that we would hear like Beethoven really as Beethoven intended it. No, we would hear as Beethoven was actually expected to be played by the audience. The audience had some demands. And there was something else in the 19th century which you can clearly and very easily reconstruct. It's all over the place. It's called like progress of art. There was a thing. Everything was in progress. They didn't build the Eiffel Towers shorter than the previous construction. Now they want to have a higher tower. I mean, it's fascinating, right? But in music, it was the same thing. They didn't want to hear Beethoven as Beethoven was played in 1810. They wanted to have Beethoven as it was played in 1892. And so if you have this large collection of data, of which maybe 70% are not worth really taking at face value, I'm just making this number up, well, then, and even then you come to the conclusion as yourself, like, but many of these data show that they did not play according to metronome marks. Metronome marks interpreted here in this document clearly as a single beat interpretation only. Well, then what is your conclusion? A 1/3/4 beat metronome solution that doesn't work? Of course, it doesn't work, because a metronome is like a binary thing. You have 1 click or you have 2 clicks. And so, from that perspective alone, from this conclusion alone, how hard is it to say, okay, it doesn't match single beat, and then by the extent of logic, it doesn't match whole beat. Some of them match whole beat, by the way. We can talk about that later. Was not mentioned here. But anyways, we are somewhere in the middle. Well, then I have bad news for you, because in order to reach that single beat, you will have to gain like 20% of speed in general, just generalizing. Well, for that, you need to talk to the Kryptonian guy, which is called Superman, because humans have a nerve and muscular system that won't change for you in order to reach single beat. And so the only solution by the logic of this one paragraph is, well, if that is the case, if this large selection of data actually disproves single beat and whole beat, then, and we know that musicians didn't have the intention primarily to follow the metronome marks at all, well, then the only conclusion is that the metronome marks were meant as whole beat. And am I so wrong at this, Stefan, or do you see that differently?
I don't. It's simple. I mean, you have, again, that's the simplicity of metronome marks. There is 2 ways to use a metronome: whole beat, single beat. That's the only 2 ways you can use a metronome, and either one has to be correct. And what the data shows from a durations perspective is that, yeah, there are a lot of assumptions that have to be made, and that, yeah, actually you land somewhere in the middle. And actually, this document could have arrived at that conclusion by itself, and it did arrive at that conclusion. And I think it's not the only one that, let's call it, researched durations. And I hope people heard the the irony here, because this is not really research, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But people, they looked at a lot of data, but they made very strong conclusions from very weak data, in a sense. And that's something we are going to look at. But yeah, it's really weird. And again, as we said, that the claim was to disprove whole beat very openly. And if we now go to the conclusion, as you can simply do, you just go to the conclusion, and in the conclusion, you can read, to sum up, based on all the data presented in this document, I believe we can reach 2 general conclusions regarding tempi and metronome marks that refute most of the premises behind the double beat theory. There is no evidence for the existence of a uniform slow tempo tradition in Europe in the 18th and 19th century, nor is there any evidence for a uniform tempo shift, which, according to you, Mr. Wim Winters, had supposedly taken place at some point during the 19th century. There is conclusive evidence showing that many of the famous composers and musicians from the mid and second half of the 19th century did not use the metronome according to double beat, as demonstrated by a very close fit between the timings these composers have themselves given and the metronome indications of the pieces which they describe when understanding in single beat. For those reasons, I believe that the data collected here makes for a decisive argument against the historical plausibility of the double beat theory.
Yeah, I mean, I hate that kind of language, because people read it and then that it gives the impression like, well, that's very serious, I mean, but you, in order to debunk this, you need like a document of like 200 pages, It's like when people make a claim that is just fitting into the narrative of a majority of a group, like in this case, the musicological interested people, or plus people in general, musicians in general, that want to keep the status quo, and they accept that. So this document was like feeded into that narrative, like very easily accepted without any critical nuance, as we explained earlier. In order to debunk that, that's like, it takes you so much time. And I really, that's kind of frustrating. But in general, I mean, like, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And that's something that I just don't get of people that just pull up that document and show it to Alberto in the conservatory in Brussels. That's like a place that is subsidized. I mean, especially in Europe, I would say. I'm not talking globally, but I mean, I'm paying taxes for that teacher to pull up a document that has no scientific value in order to just not talk to a guy who has some questions. I mean, that's an academic environment, and this is for me unacceptable. That's not to say that I have criticisms of entire musicology. Of course not. But this little section of tempo research, it's like we need to clean this up, and then you come to a conclusion like this. And if you are not interested in changing, if you are just also at the other side, like of being biased against all of Holbein, it cannot be true because whatever, and we have this, then you read this and you say, oh, these people really have done their homework, because the conclusion reads like very solidly and very firmly. But the proof is in the eating. There is a piano, there is a metronome, and like you said, just pull up the Opus 299. And when people make the claims, we can play it, well, they won't do that on stage live. They don't, because it's not possible. So, but now we're going to dive into the real problems, the data problems, right, Stefan? Because I'm looking forward to that, going through that with you, because it's something, we miss that. I've made the claims or the remarks many times, and I'm serious about that. When people would invite me for any symposia where tempos are discussed, like, really do it, and you can bring like 100 people of musicologists that are against this whole beat theory and fill the hall with all supporters for single beat. I will come, because I have nothing to prove, except I have two conditions. There must be a piano, and the moderator of these conversations should not be a musicologist. There should be someone from another department of the university. Physics, mathematics, it doesn't matter. People who are used to think in a kind of academic way, in the sense that, like, guys, what's the problem that we talk about? Can someone explain that? Why do we talk about metronome marks? I mean, there's a piano. I mean, there's a metronome. There's a score. Just play. I mean, we know it. If that would be the only conditions, but I will come, and I will pay for my own plane tickets.
That's going to be a very cool symposium. Looking forward to it. So yeah, I mean, we just went through in my estimation, the most important parts of this document. People can probably find it somewhere on the internet. But what I did now is I did two things. I used ChatGPT, and I asked ChatGPT to analyze this document, from the perspective of, you are a musicologist at university, and I want your unbiased opinion and estimation on that thing. And the second part is, again, I have a background as a mathematician, and I was shocked at the mathematical conclusions that were made in this paper. And I also asked ChatGPT to unbiasedly analyze the mathematical conclusions that have been made here. And we can start with mathematics, or we can start with musicology. Wim, which one would you like to start?
Maybe the musicology is interesting. There are some points that we can add to that.
So again, we are very transparent about this. This is not us coming up with these points. This is ChatGPT, and the prompt said very clearly to be unbiased and look at this as if you were a researcher at university. And I'm just going to go through a few of these questions and points, because they are really, really interesting. And again, the first question that came up is, what kind of document is this actually? And well, it's a large collection of historical sources with explanations and interpretations added by the author. What it is not, it's not a controlled scientific study. It's not a formal test of tempo theories, not a methodologically defined research project. So, and the reason why this is interesting, according to ChatGPT, to which I completely agree from my university background, is that different kinds of documents support different kinds of conclusions. And as we just read, this document makes very big claims. So these big claims actually have to have a big research structure, a solid research structure behind it that you can actually come to these conclusions, right?
Yeah. It's interesting that it says what it is not. And then I'm going to keep my remark for number 2 because there's an interesting point. What is the research question? That was for me like the biggest trigger. Like, you cannot, you could say like, yeah, we're researching if whole beat existed, yes or no. But why did I come up with with kind of theory, so to say, of whole beat? What is the foundation of that? And that, ChatGPT, I can read it for you if you want. Strength is, of course, and that's true. The document says it wants to test whether whole beat, double beat are historically plausible. And what is strong in this document and interesting is like the collection of data is interesting. But let's face it, it's interesting to reconstruct performance practice in the 19th century. The conclusions, of course, are very hard to make, but it's interesting to do that. But what is actually the reason why people come up with a whole beat theory? And when you describe that, the reader and many musicians, also musicians that do trust the Nortons and the Clive Browns in this regard, I'm not downplaying these people by any stretch of the imagination because they are very smart people, but in this they are blinded or biased. I have no idea. Therefore, I really would like to talk to them. But yeah, you have to really pitch very clearly what is the problem. And if you know that they don't do that, you will see it everywhere. Like the maximum or the most you will read in research papers or in books that talk about this issue, like I mentioned Clive Brown or Barry Cooper, I mean, Sandra Rosenblum, you name it, people that really talked about performance practice in the 19th century, is that when they come to the issue of metronome marks, they will say something like, yeah, metronome marks in some cases are problematic, or some of these group of metronome marks are difficult or challenging. But that's kind of like weasel words to say something else. Like in general, the totality of metronome marks make it not highly improbable, make it impossible that single beat was really what they had in mind. And so when you read these documents, what is completely frustrating to me is like, where is the exact description of the research question? It's not that some of the Chopin metronome marks are difficult or some of the group of metronome marks are problematic. No, all of them are problematic in one way or another. And it's the same for this document. I cannot be, as a person and my claims, yeah, you can say, okay, we're going to research if Winters is right, but what are his claims? Where does this document actually give a clear description of why I claim what I claim to be true?
Yeah, and also, I mean, as people can read here, the problem is that, yeah, the research question is not clearly defined, and that actually makes it in a certain way unable to actually prove the point it's making, because there is never a clear definition of what actually would prove whole beat wrong, what would confirm whole beat, because the research question is not precise, and what result would actually arrive as neutral in the middle, like what is something else coming up. And that makes this, I can completely understand, this is very frustrating, but it's simply imprecise. There is like the research methodology feels like completely absent here. And that's really weird. And I mean, if you go to the next question, how is the research done? Well, there is no clear explanation of how the decisions are made.
That's ChatGPT's conclusion. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's the observation that ChatGPT makes. I mean, there is no clear definition of which sources are included, which sources are not. How reliable are these different sources? How are contradictions handled? How is uncertainty treated? I mean, this doesn't mean that this document or this source is completely useless. That's not the point, and that's also what ChatGPT writes here. But the problem is that you cannot make strong conclusions from a weak starting point. And what is starting to show through here is that the starting point, the research question, the parameters, the measurements, that's all weak, but the conclusions are very strong. And that's kind of the theme that you will see here. The next thing,
scroll up a little bit, because it's interesting. This leads to unclear points, and then ChatGPT gives like a few bullet points why some sources are used and others not. That's like, okay, is that a complete set or not? How reliable different sources are considered? How reliable different sources are considered? How contradictions are handled? It's a super important point. Actually, it's impressive because this document contains data that are actually very close, if not spot on, with whole beat. Even list claim or remark of the Hammerklavier's duration, it's like it's listed under lists remarks that I have to say, like the Hammerklavier Sonate presque une heure, so almost an hour. And now people will go and say like, okay, but the Hammerklavier Sonata played by Alberto was 1 hour and 15 minutes. Yeah, that's his first attempt. He slowed down, or he took like a little bit slower tempo, slower even in the Adagio, which is like a massive piece. I mean, it's not like a normal size composition. His second version, which we never released, was 65 minutes. That's the actual metronomic calculated durations of the Hammerklavier Sonata, and you can tell because there's only one repeat in the A section of the first movement. So the Hammerklavier Sonata is very easy to calculate, so to say. And so 63 minutes is 65 minutes is the actual duration in whole beat, and let's say almost 1 hour. I mean, that's Franz Liszt talking about the duration of the Hammerklavier Sonata, and you can, of course, expect that Liszt didn't take the score and just calculated the bar numbers. It's just from his experience. So another thing that's not in this research document is like Beethoven's 45 minutes of the Ninth Symphony, and I'm not kidding. That's directly from Beethoven's mouth. We know that from his conversation books. This is something that even Martin Norton in his doctoral thesis on Beethoven's tempo indications does not talk about. But how are you going to explain that from a single beat perspective, that the Ninth Symphony was even faster than the absolute fastest performance of today by 15 minutes or so? There is an explanation for that, and I have it reconstructed in the book. So that's so true. Like at face value, if you make a list in this document, which data go to single beat, that there are always the calculated durations, like a composer that writes like the duration on top of his piece, or just the Alcon calculations from his concerts, or they go to whole beat, and then they are like real durations. Even then, for us, they are not important because there can be the same problems, but the majority is in the middle. And that's an excellent point. Why do you only, like, that was my problem initially with this document. It's so clearly biased against like one of the two solutions that you cannot take it at face value anymore. And I remember, and that's not a digression. Years ago, there was a video released about the Kinderszenen of Schumann, with the durations based upon real actual performance that we can still measure, like the students of Clara Schumann. Now, I don't know if we made a video on that or podcast, or I wrote it in the book. We have remarks by Clara Schumann that actually was condemning, not in a negative way, the playing of I think it was Fanny Davis or another student of hers. Not saying that she played badly, but she said like she plays too energetically and too fast. And they didn't want to correct that in that time. It's very interesting, but that's the subject for another podcast. But the guy made an overview of like the durations and then compared it to whole beat. And he said, yeah, it doesn't match whole beat, which didn't surprise me, except, of course, the Traumerei. But that didn't match single beat either. And I didn't make a video of that because at a certain time you get sick and tired of like always going through the same process. But people are biased against whole beat. If you would step back one step, and that's what you was just reading in this document again. Also, you would just take one step back, and you just look at the whole. Then, yeah, you would see yourself that you're biased against one solution, because your data indeed prove that the truth is there in the middle, that musicians didn't play according to the metronome marks again. So that's yeah, that's maybe a long elaboration, but that's an important point to me from a musicological perspective, because musicians, musicologists, we're not scientists in the sense like you, like data analysis. I mean, my daughter, psychology, she has spent so much time understanding statistics and whatever. But it's important that you do that, because then you can read these data. We don't have that training. So it's very dangerous to make those conclusions which you're going to debunk. But from a logical perspective, you can position this very easily in the context of its time, in terms like of facts that we can check, that we can read, that we can position. And even then, on this basis, this document fails. It's so obviously biased against that quote-unquote theory that I launched.
Yeah. And it will become more obvious. But again, the next point that ChatGPT makes is that, a key problem of durations, and that's the garbage in, garbage out that I keep coming back to. Concert durations, they depend, or they can mean different things. Tempo, cuts, repeats, performance habits, program structure, all of these points, you have to factor them in. And the problem is that this document treats durations as if they basically reflect tempo. Other explanations are not ruled out in any way. Again, this is very imprecise. And I mean, it's very, very weird and biased in a way. And as ChatGPT says it in simple terms, one observation is used to explain many possible causes, but only one cause is followed through. And that's where you said this document is very biased in one direction. This is exactly what ChatGPT says here. It's very biased against whole beat, and only that is followed through. And again, the next thing is the connection to metronome marks. That's really interesting, because what this document does, it compares historical durations with calculated metronome tempos, and also, which I completely don't understand, modern performances. What are the modern performances doing here? They have nothing to do with the question, with the research that you're tackling. Again, you want to debunk whole beat. What do the modern performances that we now play have in common with these, with whole beat and concert durations in the 18th and 19th century? That's completely weird. And what ChatGPT says here, what is missing? A step-by-step explanation of how concert duration becomes evidence for a specific beat interpretation, so whole beat or single beat. There is no clear step here. So the argument cannot really be decisive because of the large amounts of imprecision that are present here. And that's so blatantly obvious. It's crazy.
But this is the point where the majority of musicians and musicologists that do not want to change anything from their current status, like what we think of music of the past, that they do, because this is the crux. They connect, and they all do that. Temporally did that in the 60s with the George March durations and what have you. They go to modern, the Alcon durations, the same thing. They go to modern performances and see they find a magical match. There's of course no match, because you don't know, as you said, what the data of durations, what they really represent in the 19th century. We have a completely different concert scene. People were cutting pieces out, and not only leaving movements, they were like leaving parts of movements because they were too difficult, there was not time enough, the program didn't fit, whatever. But that's all, of course, never talked about. And that makes this, what you say, garbage in, garbage out. We have to analyze each and every of these data individually and say, are we really sure that this was played in its entirety? Do we have like secondary sources talk about this? That the guy of the 1808 concert, Mr. Reichert, said 4 hours. We take it at face value. But in fact, you could say like that's useless, as worthless, because we do not have any other source giving like a similar duration. So we are totally reliant on somebody who gives like a duration, even not with the intention of tempo reconstruction, because that's also what the document actually fails to say. None of these sources were given like with the precision, like, for future people who wanted to reconstruct. No, therefore we had a metronome mark. But this match between historical duration, so to say, and modern performances is leading many people, and go online, you'll find that claim, to say like, but you know what it really proves? is that metronome marks were never meant as tempo indications because musicians didn't take care of it. And you start laughing, but it is true. That's the real essential thing. The Fafner document, they wanted to take it to a next level, and they wanted to take it like to a mathematical level, and then they will meet you, and people like you. But in general, that's what people take from historical durations. Nowhere in history metronome marks were taken at face value. So why would we? They were never meant to be like tempo indications, which is in itself the most absurd claim you can make, because every source of the 19th century talking about the metronome says the opposite.
Exactly. That's, yeah. If we go to the next few points, maybe a little bit quicker. I mean, the relation to existing research. Yeah, it's not really a settled study. It looks more like an intervention, by the way it's framed. There are many historical sources that are cited, and the author shows familiarity with existing literature, but there is no overview of the full research landscape. There is no explanation of how this work fits in. Counter arguments are mentioned, but not structurally addressed, and that's one of the main points you also make. It only looks in exactly one direction, which is whole beat is not it, but it doesn't also structurally address these arguments. I mean, the next point is, yeah, it's anonymity. I mean, this affects, of course, the trust and the context. Of course, the data still remains the same, but it's a relevant point here. And again, anonymity is unusual in a public debate. I mean, it's, as ChatGPT says here, anonymity is normal during peer review, but then in a public scholarly debate, it's unusual. And again, the last point is,
but you can also ask Stefan, why?
Yeah, exactly.
Why does someone? I mean, you have a document. You did a lot of work. I mean, the data that are collected are really, of course,
it's impressive.
You have to double check. It took like months. Because it's not just a simple Google search, and then you refuse to say who you are, then you don't believe. Then there is something that is like at the back of your mind, like this little voice saying, like, "Where is the back door in case this all backfires?" You know. And I may be a little bit too harsh but you cannot be harsh enough, because it's like people making claims that they cannot back up themselves, and they still want to have this podium. You know, this is like in a way it's spoiling the discussion, because it's so biased, and it's stepping into this overall narrative that I was talking about. People just want to hear this, and then there is your document that gets a lot of traction, but your name is not there. You should own that. People should be able to talk to you. You should, and when you are not sure that would really work in long term, because one day when the book comes out, I mean, fixing the Beethoven mistake, I can promise that a lot of people who do the effort of reading my chapter on duration will come to and it's not even with the mathematical conclusions that you will make, will come to the opposite conclusion of this document. Well, if you hold that in the back of your mind that that's possible, then you should not publish this. And claiming but I'm not a researcher. Imagine we would be talking to Fafner in 1988 and say, but I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to make the claims. I'm not a researcher or whatever. Then don't publish it. You either own it or you don't. But when you don't, you give a clear hint, at least to me, as to why you don't want to be mentioned as in your full name. There is something fishy about this.
Yeah, and again, the point that is now being made is the strength of the conclusions, and that's what we already came to a lot of times. This document moves back, and that's the observation by ChatGPT, by the way, moves back and forth between describing data and drawing strong conclusions. The problem is some conclusions go further than the method allows. In simple terms, the evidence supports a discussion, but not the final answers that this paper or this article was set out to arrive at. And that's the big thing. I mean, and if we now come maybe to the overall assessment before we get to the mathematical part, what this document does well, according to ChatGPT, is that it gathers a large amount of historical timing information. It makes many sources easily available, and it shows that the 19th century performance practice was diverse. Okay. What does it not prove? And that's really interesting. It does not prove that whole beat, double beat is historically impossible, that there was one clear tempo norm, that durations alone can explain metronome markings. So how ChatGPT claims a university researcher would classify it, it's a valuable source collection with interpretation, not a decisive or final research study. And to summarize it in one sentence, this document is very useful for showing how varied historical performance was, but its structure does not allow it to settle the tempo debate in a definitive way.
And that leads to the mathematical analysis, right?
Yeah, in a way. And why are we talking about a mathematical analysis? I'm going to go back to the paper itself, because again, I stumbled across probabilities. Again, we have this case study here of the third and ninth symphony with concrete durations. And what then is claimed in this paper is that if we take I'm quoting now, sorry, if we take our data to be representative of the historical range of tempi for these symphonies as they existed at the period, the probability that we arrive at are 0.017% for the Eroica and 0.0003% for the Ninth Symphony of having been historically performed in double beat. And that the follow-up claim is this makes...
Wait a second, because it goes a little bit too fast. So there is a kind of statistical research that they have done based on the data on durations of the third and the ninth symphony by Beethoven. And from that, whatever statistical model, they derive to the conclusion that there is only 0.017% for the Eroica and even less for the ninth symphony of a chance that once in history was performed in whole beat, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the conclusion that they arrive. And the final sentence I wanted to make, this makes the existence of single beat tempi 1,136 times more likely for the Eroica and 53,000 something times for the ninth symphony given our data. And that's quite a claim. And also the probability for single beat, however, is only mentioned in a footnote. And I'm going to read that footnote. On the other hand, the probability that we get for single beat are 19.5% for the Eroica and 16.6% for the ninth, which is not surprising given that the amount of the reported timings tend to be on the slow side compared to Beethoven's metronome indication. And that's interesting. So by your statistical analysis, to which I'm going to get to in a minute, even single beat is only likely 19.5%. Yeah, but what about the 18 or the 80 something percent that remain in the middle? What about that? That is not mentioned here.
Yeah.
Again, and that's this kind of, there is this bulk of data and the analysis that is made, and then it only points in one direction, which is whole beat is not it. Yeah, but single beat is also not it, because there is this over 80% of something in the middle that you're not even taking into consideration, which is basically people played how they wanted.
But this is that, let's say there is a statistical model. I have no idea how that works. But just a question before we start into the details, and it's from a layman's perspective. If you would add to this research or this model that there is no single performance we have of the third and the ninth symphony that exactly match the metronome marks in single beat, would that change the outcome? Because if I hear your reading, there is a probability of 19.5% of whatever, it's too small for my old eyes to read, and 16 point whatever percent of the Eroica that was played in single beat. If we would add to that we do not have any performance over the last 100 years that match a single beat interpretation of these symphonies, then this claim becomes ridiculous, right? Because you can say I have 16.5% that it was played in single beat, but single beat has been proven by 100 years of recording technology that it's unreachable.
I mean, that's it's difficult to get to that point, but the basic point I want to make is that this complete statistical analysis is absolutely unusable by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay.
It is completely unusable and completely irrelevant because they are backwards proving their own point by the way they do it. So again, you would have to talk about all of these points if you would be making a real statistical analysis. The point you're making is very interesting and should be talked about, but that's a consistent theme if you look at this from a musicological perspective and from a mathematical perspective. There is so much imprecision and implicit assumptions made in this paper or in this article that, yeah, it's beyond usable, actually, in a way. And again, I just wanted to show these percentages because, again, if you talk about percentages, I start thinking as a mathematician, and you make like very strong claims. It's like 50,000%, 50,000 times, more likely that it was played in single beat. Well, again, as I did from musicological perspective, I asked ChatGPT, please analyze the statistical analysis that is made. And because my feeling was, and I'm not on top of my mathematical knowledge, again, my university is like 5 years ago that I had my degree. If I would have given this to a colleague of mine who just finished his doctor thesis, he would be able to talk about this way more in depth. But my sense, all my alarm bells were going off in my head, and ChatGPT actually confirmed that. And again, I didn't ask it to confirm my point of view. I asked it for an unbiased opinion on the mathematical perspective. And we're going to go through that now, and I will try to make you understand why this is unusable. So what is crucial in mathematics is that the results that you're talking about always depend on the assumptions that you make. And the probabilities that you chose here, they depend on the statistical model that is lying in the background. And the document never explains which model is used and why it is justified to use that model.
And can you elaborate a little bit on that? So the assumption and things like that, explain that a little bit more in depth, because for me, you go too fast now.
That's okay. I mean, for a lot of people, then I'm going too fast. But basically, when you have data, you can look at the mean of the data. So you take all of the data points and you just divide them by the number of data points. Then you get like the mean, the average. What is the average duration that they make? And then you can make all kinds of analysis of the data set, but what this guy wants to do is he wants to attach probabilities, and to arrive at a probability from data, you have to have that's called a probability distribution in the background. And this guy basically chose a certain distribution that defines the likelihood of certain outcomes, and that distribution, the choice of that distribution is never verified. It's never double checked. You have a lot of ways of checking if the data set is actually fitted well to the model that he chose. And let me explain it maybe in a little bit of a different way. What this guy did is he had data, and he just assumed that the data follows a normal distribution. And the normal distribution, that's this bell curve that you know, from Gauss, the bell curve that you know. And what you could then do is you could take that normal distribution and you could just pick random, you could have it generate random numbers. And then what you could do is you could see if these numbers actually kind of fit roughly the numbers that you have that you made the model from. And what you would realize is that the numbers that this bell curve generates, they do not fit at all with the numbers that you have on durations. And that's kind of this misfit. And this guy just assumed that it fits well, but it absolutely does not fit well.
Okay,
You could prove that mathematically by putting like a measurement to it. You can always see how well does a distribution fit for a certain data set.
So the distribution would be like the premise is like single beat was the correct norm. We have this set of data. We're going to enter all the data's duration. And then what's the outcome of this bell curve? Like what's the average? So how does it work from there?
It's not about the claim is not single beat is true or not. Basically, what this guy did is he said, okay, I have this set of durations, and I have whole beat and I have single beat, and I want to have like a probability that a performance in the 19th century lasted 58 minutes. And the thing that translates this, okay, I want something 58 minutes, that translates in between, that's the statistical model. That's the probability distribution. So basically he took his data and he just assumed that this data was following a normal distribution, it's called. And that means that if you would ask now the question, how likely is it that whole beat or single beat was a thing? The normal distribution gives you an answer for that. And that's what this guy did, or these guys. But the problem is that the assumption that this data follows a normal distribution, that is never justified, never proven, and probably completely wrong, because you can fit a way better distribution model in the middle.
Okay. Yeah. Still, I'm a little puzzled by, because the discussion starts here whether it's a whole beat or single beat is a correct reading of metronome marks.
Yeah.
So if I understand you well, he makes a certain average calculation based upon durations data. But where I mean, and then he comes to the conclusion that you just read, like single beat is 50,000 times more likely to have been the case. But where do you actually connect this average, whatever statistical, whatever outcome you have, to whether whole beat or single beat is the more likely outcome?
Because what he basically did is he took the data, he used a statistical model to then attach probabilities to different durations.
Okay.
And he said that, well, the mean that's going to have, so the average of all the duration, that's going to be the middle. That's going to have the highest likelihood, and all of the other points at the side are going to have a lower likelihood. And that means if you have I don't know what the mean was in his calculation. Let me just take a look. Here you see it, the mean and the standard deviation. That's what you see here. And for example, for the third symphony, you see that, okay, single beat is 42, double beat is 84, and the mean of all the performances, all being only 10, is 49 minutes. So the model that he came up with is, okay, 49 minutes, that's like the middle. That's the highest likelihood that a performance in the past lasted 49 minutes. That's the middle.
Okay.
And then you move to the outside, and then you see, okay, how high is the chance that a performance lasted 56 minutes? And that the distribution will give you an answer to that.
Yeah, but there is no connection between a metronome mark and this average duration. Because then okay, I understand now how they come to this number, but it's not because the ultimate point is like, okay, when 49 minutes, it's the average duration. 42 minutes is single beat. Yeah, but nobody arrives at 42 minutes. It's technically not possible.
That's also another point. I mean, that's something that they that they clearly do not take into consideration.
And then you should do that for all, like if you would do that like for 50,000 pieces, so to say, of 5,000 metronome marks, so to say, which have then I can start to understand. Then the only thing that would show is like, okay, but there is never ever a match with single beat. And so what's the probability then? So I'm just thinking as an amateur, I'm a layman. I mean, but that's for me so obvious that they take a model, and of course, the statistical model doesn't know that single beat is highly problematic from a technical perspective. But you should insert that in your data set, right?
Well, no, you shouldn't. The data should show it by itself. And it would, because, well, apparently there is one performance in 1820 that lasted 41 minutes, which is faster than but whatever. I mean, you also have to check the data. Here also comes the garbage in, garbage out metric that you have always when it comes to data. Because here's also a performance that lasted 33 minutes of the Eroica. That I would like to have heard. I mean, but it's so if we just take this point, so they just assumed that the amount of data is following a normal distribution, which they never justified. They never checked it. They never verified that it's actually the case. And that's the assumption that you can make here, that's mathematically completely inaccurate. You would have to show that the model that you're using is actually justified for the data that you're using. And that's not happening here. And that's the second point that people see here from ChatGPT. The bell curve is simply assumed. It's not demonstrated, it's just assumed. And the point being, and that's why I'm talking so much about this statistical model, is the choice of model that they made resulted in the probabilities that they arrived at. If they would have chosen a different distribution, they could have tweaked the percentages in any way which they wanted. I could choose a statistical distribution that makes whole beat 20 million times more likely than the other one, because the model is never justified. I mean, this is basically close to being completely arbitrary. I can choose a different model if I don't prove the fit of the model that says whole beat is 20 million times more likely than single beat.
We should publish that document that you're going to make.
I mean, I would never publish such a document because I know that the model is mathematically unjustified. But I could do that. If I were to follow their methodology, I could prove the exact opposite point.
Yeah.
Because I never check whether the model that I use actually fits towards the data I'm looking at.
Yeah. And that's not to say that, of course, all the data that are in there, like the garbage in, garbage out, like just the 33 minutes of the Eroica, the chances are like 100% that was not a full symphony, but they just assume like 33 minutes full symphony, boom. You're skewing the data with that obvious fact, I would say. So
yes, yeah. And you're skewing the data even more seriously because per symphony you only have 10 data points. That's nothing. That is this amount of data is a joke. I mean, if you talk when I was at the doctoral thesis that my good friend of mine from uni made. I mean, he had I don't know how many data points. It was like 10 to the power of 6, so like 1 million, 10 million, 100 million data points that he was making statistical models from. And these guys are making a statistical model from 10 data points. And then your point of these outliers, they skew the whole distribution in an incredible way.
Yeah.
And it's just, and ChatGPT says it here very accurately. The curve's shape is mostly guesswork. You're just guessing a distribution. And that's mathematically wrong on so many levels. And the last point is, the model is built from the same data it judges. Okay, you're basically using the data to build a model to then prove the data. And it's like you're spinning in circles.
Yeah. In other words, it's backwards proving your point that you made up before you started to investigate.
Yeah. So it's like the curve is built using the number. So let's just read this here. The average and spread comes from the data. So like the parameters of the distribution come from the data. The curve is built using those numbers, and the same curve is then used to decide what is likely. It's like that is wrong on so many levels, and that's so cool now, because the conclusions that they arrive at, they are actually not properties of the data. They are properties of the distribution of the model that they chose in the middle. And that's just, for a mathematician, that's plainly obvious. So basically they have this statement of like, this is 50,000 times more likely. Yeah, that's because of the distribution you chose. Again, I can choose a different distribution. I will not justify it. That makes whole beat 50,000 times more likely than single beat. Just by choosing a different model. If I don't have to justify the model, I mean, I can prove whatever the hell I want.
Okay.
That's just complete bullshit. And the conclusion here is so cool. I mean, the mathematical question that they have here now is that this distribution answers the question: if I have this bell curve, which duration of the 9th or 3rd symphony is most likely to have happened in the 18th and 19th century? So, and then the mathematics answers the question, okay, I actually prefer single beat compared to whole beat. But there is absolutely no connection to what actually happened historically. So the actual point they want to prove, that's completely besides the pseudo calculations that they make. And I cannot call it any other way. These are pseudo calculations. And that's the last point here. The calculations are mathematically correct. But the question asked and the model, that's not correct. The mathematics is fine. The assumptions are never tested, and the certainty comes from the model and not the actual sources. And as I said, I can choose a completely different model that gives you a completely different outcome. I can basically, if I don't test my model, I can give you any outcome that I want in the fucking world.
Mm-hmm. Like
I can prove whatever I want. If I can choose my model arbitrarily, cool.
Yeah.
And
like I said, it's like a bookkeeper. My wife is accountant. They can make you rich at the end of the year while having earned nothing.
Yeah, it's it is so. I hope I can. Sorry.
Or poor. That's a better way in terms of bookkeeping.
Yeah, bookkeeping. If you're poorer, that's better. But yeah, so this is. I hope I kind of it was possible for me to make this understandable. Why this is mathematically unusable. Absolutely unusable in a mathematical way.
And that's all on top, like assuming that the data are reliable, because when you go there, then you have nothing to build upon.
And here comes the saying, garbage in, garbage out. That's exactly what you're talking about. The data that you use to define the distribution, if you have garbage data, the distribution will be trash and the model will result in bullshit. Mm-hmm. That's exactly where garbage in, garbage out comes to play in mathematics, precisely in this situation that we're talking about here. And again, there is this apparent impressive certainty that is produced by the assumptions and not the historical data. And that's exactly what I said here. The model is everything, and the model has assumptions beneath it that are not talked about, and these assumptions are proving the point, not the historical data itself.
Yeah.
And that's like that's incredible. It's just you can prove anything you want with math, but you have to make the right assumptions. And I mean, I got a sentence from ChatGPT that I want to read as a final step to this. It's like mathematics is like a microscope. If you choose the wrong lens, you don't just get a blurry image, you get a very sharp image of the wrong thing. And that's what happened here.
And it's interesting, even though, I mean, still, for me, it's like above my pay grade in this sense. But I can understand the model, and I can understand what they try to do. For me, the takeaway of this is like the fact that you have to search for these kinds of methods to prove single beats probability historically, because you don't have anything to show today. Well, not saying again that there are no single beat performances, but in general, we'll be talking about the entire set of data. That proves something. That proves there is a huge problem. I would say statistically speaking, but that's of course totally nonsense. But in the context of this discussion, that's maybe a better way of saying that you have to explain the probable existence of single beat in this way with skewed data, with kind of a model that has its problems on its own. That is maybe the biggest takeaway of this entire document and effort. Even people who make this huge, gigantic effort to debunk Win-Winters and, let's say, by extension, the existence of whole beat, they have nothing to show. And then they come to these kinds of discussion. I mean, we can go into detail. I'm looking at the screen also with their final point, with like all these so-called single beat descriptions of metronome descriptions. I mean, let's keep that for another point. In the book, of course, we'll talk about that extensively. There's a chapter on whole beat in the 19th century, where the melodic directions are in the key part. By the way, I found the English melodic directions. They're going to be sent to me. And we did it was kind of Sherlock Holmes investigation, because the melodic directions in the English version, 1816, were not the first one. They were probably first published in French, but it's the most famous one because Talsma published part of them in 1981. But no other book that was published recently or before that that talks about the melodic directions had actually the exact reference where it was published and whatever, but I'll keep the premiere for the book. But anyways, we can talk about that like in detail but that's my biggest problem. You have to go into detail, contextualize everything. And of course, on a general, this makes headlines because, hey, see, whole beat is debunked. We know it. It's in the document. And now we have to make a podcast of 1.5 hours. You're talking for 40 minutes about statistical improbabilities and model things or whatever. But I'm sorry, you have to do that. And if you're not willing to walk that walk, then are we really interested in reconstructing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? I sometimes wonder, like Beethoven comes back and he gives a concert with the Fifth Symphony. Would you go and listen? I think majority of people would say no, not interested. Czerny comes back to teach about Bach. I mean, would you go to his lessons? Well, no, because we hate this edition, right? I mean, and I like making these comparisons because it makes it so clear. You of course, you give a face to these people. Hey, Beethoven comes back, would you go and listen? And what if he plays it a different way? I kid you not, to have discussions where people are open-minded and say, yeah, that would be just another interpretation.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that's fine. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about like what did that metronome half note 108, which he gave for the first movement, what does it actually mean? Whether you would like his performance or my performance or that tempo, it doesn't make any sense. If Beethoven would have had a faster tempo in the afternoon and in the morning, we don't care because he just gave that metronome mark. And the published metronome marks, you can also make a case they are very strong and strict and they were tested and what have you. But I don't care if Beethoven actually would play faster or slower. It's about the meaning of that metronome mark. And when these people have to go through these extensive like pseudo calculations or whatever models in order to prove that single beat was 50,000 times more probable, well, the poor pianist who has to prove that on the symposium that I am invited to, it doesn't help him or her to know that 50 is like statistically speaking, 50,000 times more likely to play that Czerny etude in single beat because it won't happen.
Yeah. And that's only according to their calculation. Again, I could come up if I wanted to, and I would have had the time. I could come up with a model that would give you the exact opposite conclusion.
But Stefan, I promise you, I write it down. When I would be in that situation, hypothetically, like me against 20 other musicologists, and that musician would walk on stage, I would ask the moderator to pull up this document and say, like, good luck, because you have a 50,500 times more probable chance that you're going to play it in single beat compared to whole beat. So that must be a success, right? I mean, with that sentence, you would kill the entire discussion. Everybody would start to laugh, and how ridiculous it is.
Yeah, but guess what? Mathematically, very funny is that even if it's 50,000 times more likely, if the probability is 0 that you're going to do it, that the result is still 50,000 times 0. That's still 0.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, of course, that's now highly inaccurate in a lot of ways. So let's not go down that route. But I think if we were to summarize this document, it makes very strong claims, but there is very little methodology, mathematically and musicologically backing these strong claims up. It's like you're building a skyscraper on sand.
Yeah.
And you're not doing the proper work to actually start that. Like the fundamentals are not there for this thing to stand, actually.
Yeah.
And that's if you summarize it very succinctly, that's what this document is all about.
Yeah, and you have to go reconstruct the context. And there are very excellent books published, like in the recent years, about concert practice in that time in Vienna in the 19th century. If you would just know that the London Philharmonic Orchestra, at the famous orchestra that George Martin had the baton for, like was conductor in the 1930s, 40s, only started to play entire symphonies in the late 1880s. So and that's this study, this book, that's not this compilation of sources. If Fafner and his team wanted to have anything more general to say, those studies of at least the concert practices of that time should have been involved. And then they would know that the problem, like Temperley says in the 1960s, that the problem of cuts is immense. We have no idea. Even Ferdinand Ries, student of Beethoven, wrote to Beethoven when he illegally, so to say, did the premiere in Frankfurt, I think, of the Ninth Symphony, illegally because it was bought by the Philharmonic Society in London to have the premiere. And so Beethoven, of course, couldn't wait and sent it to Ries. He said, like, yeah, the Adagio we had to cut massively because it was too difficult to play. This shows not only that it was a practice, but it was an accepted practice, because otherwise Ries would not write that to the composer, right? And so just to make you think, the listener to this podcast, I can only encourage you to go and read some books or rate on our book, because we will have a lot of summaries there. The context is very clear. These data are highly unreliable. When Liszt says like the 8th Symphony lasts 25 minutes, which he does in this document, it's an important source, of course, then you have to realize that 25 minutes matches also the last movement of the 8th Symphony in whole beat. And so you don't know about which quote-unquote symphony he's talking about. It was so ingrained in their practice. So from a musicological perspective, this is what you should have done. Yeah. So, but overall, I mean, Stefan, thank you for your explanation. I hope that people wake up, but I doubt it. It's a story of the emperor without clothes. We need that little girl that say actually is naked, and then everybody who was claiming to see clothes, because when you know the story goes, whenever people were seeing him not dressed, that meant that they were evil people. You know, that was the story. That is the fairy tale. So therefore everybody's claiming like, yeah, single beat, of course, but there should be someone there. If it would be me or us, I doubt that a little bit. The book might make a difference, but only in that regard, that we are waiting for that one influential person that say like, maybe we should reconsider this, and then everybody will say like, yeah, but single beat is a joke. And we come to a very interesting point, and we make that a lot of times, which is interesting to point this out. Nothing has to change. It will give permission to people to play like that and whole beat. It will give like maybe a more difficult time to the conservatory teacher that cannot pull up this document anymore to the Alberto Sanas of the future and say like, yeah, it's all proven, it's all nonsense. No, they will have to come up with real answers. But if you want to play like today, well, it's an historically evolved performance practice. You could say like, even the people of the hip movement, historically informed performance practice, are less historical than the mainstream pianists who play on a Steinway, because that's the real evolution. But if you want to go back, then there is no escape from the metronome marks. I'm sorry. All these conservatory departments that are heavily subsidized, and I come back to that because I think it's a waste of money in many instances. Like, what do you teach actually? You should be held accountable. Alberto's teacher in Brussels, they're just teaching like the modern practices, so they don't have an answer. They should stop claiming they have one. But they can embrace like modern performance practice. Why not? Who is going to say that Chopin wouldn't embrace that when he comes back? I'm not so sure. For Beethoven, we are pretty sure that he hated every performance that was like a little bit off. And from Chopin, actually, we know it as well because the metronome never left his piano, as famously Mikuli said, one of his students. But it's irrelevant. But when you go back in time and you want to make that claim, like we are reconstructing this, and there is an army of listeners today that really thinks that the Van Immersils and the Gardners and the Zanders really do that effort. Well, they don't, because they rely upon this document to justify their tempos. Hey, my tempos are the same as in the 19th century. Well, you don't know that because the data are not really strong, so you don't know that. But other than that, it's like we know that this is not like what the composer intended, and that's my problem. So we'll see how it changes people's minds. The only thing we can do is like take it step by step, right?
Exactly. And I mean, you summarized it perfectly. Do you want to play historically evolved or historically informed? That's two doors and you can choose. And we are going for the historical reconstruction, and you are free to do it differently. But then don't claim that this is how it was meant to be played by Beethoven in an exact way. And I think with all of that and enough of my mathematical and statistical babbling, it's time to wrap up this podcast. If you guys have any questions, drop them somewhere. We will most likely find them. And if we don't, then just send them to us via email. And then we will definitely get to them. And with that, I thank you guys for your attention. And Mr. Winters, have a good start to 2026, because this is going to be launched just before that, and to everyone listening, of course, as well. And yeah, I think with that, I'll leave you in peace. Have a nice day, morning, evening, whenever you're listening to that. And we'll be back very soon again.